Okay, so I'm Justin McMechan. I'm a crop protection and cropping systems specialist, and I'm joined today by Nick Seiter, who's with the University of Illinois, and he's going to be talking about management of Dectes. But I'm going to start us off with a bit of a background biology on Dectes Stem Borer. So to kick us off, Dectes Stem Borer is a small cerambycid beetle, and it's a longhorn beetle is their common name for the group it's in, and it's one of two species of Dectes that's found in North America here. And the other one, Sei, is not quite as common to see. It's up, North Dakota area and east of there. Dectes Stem Borer texanus species is quite a bit more broader in its range and can be found across a large part of the U.S. The key thing about this insect is it's historically a pest of sunflower. So when we talk about its range being quite broad, it's in reference to sunflower. And I should say that reference to sunflower, cultivated sunflower, it's a key thing to mention cultivated, because wild sunflower is not really a good host for this. There are other borers that are found on sunflower that people often get confused with Dectes. But Dectes stem borer, at least according to some unpublished work, very infrequent infesting wild sunflower. First reports to soybean or its movement onto soybean was in the late 1960s. And it's since kind of spread around. I'll show a map here on the next slide that kind of describes where it is and some updates to that map as well. For us in Nebraska, it kind of crossed into Nebraska, infesting soybean. It was always present in the area on sunflower, but infesting soybean in the 2000s. So we moved to this zones of adaptations map. You could see that there are several numbers on there. Bushman and Slaughterbeck have that paper that kind of documents, not yet known to occur on soybeans, and then different levels of kind of pest presence or potential as a significant pest in a statewide. And you could see three gray kind of outlined areas there, one that extends from the Texas Panhandle up into Nebraska. And some of our counterparts in the industry have indicated that this extends up into South Dakota now as well. But then there's that Mississippi, Ohio River Valley area, and then along the Atlantic coast is kind of another group that are adapted to feeding or found on soybean. And so what that broad kind of geographic occurrence on soybean indicates, they were probably pre-adapted to this or had some level of pre-adaptation to soybeans. I should mention that their ability on soybeans and their fitness on soybeans is documented to be a little less than sunflower. They're about 40% lighter when they're on feeding on a soybean plant versus, say, a sunflower plant. So that gives us a lot of indication, and Nick will probably talk about this, is some of that potential advantage we could use to sunflowers as a trap crop, and he'll get into more conversation about that later in the management section. So as we get to the life cycle of this insect, first of all, it's a univoltine or one generation per year insect. And we'll start with the adults and then kind of run our way through its path. But typically we see this in mid to late June. Geographically, that first occurrence varies across the U.S. on where this insect is found. I'll show some Nebraska data from Zach Rystrom, who did his master's here at UNL, on when he was finding it in Nebraska. But they show up anywhere in that mid to late June timeframe, and they have this rather long, pre-oviposition period prior to egg laying. It varies depending whether it's in a lab setting or in the field, but 10 to 12 or 14 days. They can lay eggs for a long time throughout the season, and you're going to see some of that. Where do we find eggs on the plants throughout the course of the season? You're going to see a couple slides on that. And then the adults are long-lived. I'm really kind of setting the stage for Nick here on the challenges with the biology of this insect and how difficult it is to manage. Egg laying varies depending on what host it's on as well, but approximately 33 or so eggs. The photos I have on that particular slide show the eggs. They're decent in size, but often kind of hid under where the female feeds on the undersides of petioles on soybean. And so this is a very delicate process that takes some time, but they'll spend a good 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes feeding on the underside of that petiole, kind of working out a groove, and then eventually oviposit that egg into there. There can be multiple eggs, laid, but essentially after that egg hatches, then they start burrowing into those petioles of the plant, into that pith area of that petiole to feed on it. So looking at the next slide here on adult emergence, this is data that really highlights there's a lot of sources on this throughout the U.S. with various entomologists that have worked on this topic, but I figured I'd show you some Nebraska information from 2014. So you can see that the first sweeps were picked up here in late June, and then they continue with activity all the way through until August. And so that just tells you, that peak activity occurred in early July, mid-July. We catch them each year, and I have some gallmage traps, which are actually just a modified corn rootworm emergence trap, and we catch them in those as we're tracking soybean gallmage each spring. We certainly see them through this whole time frame, so I don't think a lot has changed in the last decade in terms of their emergence. Probably more critically is this slide on egg laying, which really shows, how long they're infesting soybeans in a given area. So we've got mean eggs per 5 plants. Beginning in that first week after infestation, we start to see them. They peak by the second week, but they continue all the way out to week 7. And so that long period of egg laying, that really matches kind of the occurrence of adults in the field, poses a considerable challenge as we try and manage these insects. So as we kind of get back to this, larvae, I've mentioned that initially the eggs are kind of laid on those petioles. They hatch, they feed within the pith, and that's a period of 1 to 2 weeks where they're going to be feeding within that petiole before they burrow into that main stem or stalk. Once they're in there, they're in there for the remainder of the season, and they're really hidden as soon as the eggs are laid. So from any sort of potential strategies, they're secluded within the plant. They'll feed up and down that stem throughout the course of the season, and they're really, you can find them in any place on there. The photos here are a great descriptor of what you might see, say, on that petiole. If you have a petiole that maybe hasn't wilted, but you see those under markings, if you tear that open, you might see dark discolorations within there, some reddening. Those are indications of infestation. The same thing occurs in the main stem when they're feeding in that main stem area. And it is possible to find multiples within a stem. Although at the end of the season, you're likely just to find one. Rare occasions, you might find 2 because they are cannibalistic. So if they run into one another, they are fairly aggressive. And they're all competing for those overwintering chambers that I'll get to at the base of the plant. I've got girdling there at the bottom in terms of their potential to girdle up to a 1/2 inch radius. This is a bit of the differentiations between cultivated sunflowers, which is a much bigger stalk stem, versus soybean, which have much smaller stems. The potential to girdle soybeans is quite high, and sunflowers, it's a little bit more difficult if the stalks are larger. That triggered sense of when to produce overwintering chambers, is in part the senescence of plants, but it's really about the moisture of what's in those plants is kind of the factor behind that. There's some pretty good data in sunflowers that indicates as moisture drops below about 70%, they start to girdle, and re-wetting of stalks and sunflowers can keep them going back into feeding mode. Not as much as knowing about what happens on soybean, but we can kind of assume from sunflower that a similar occurrence might occur. And so, early maturing soybeans and things that are senescing early, or environmental conditions that cause early senescence of soybeans can trigger potentially more girdling of stems, and thus any bad conditions that might follow. High winds, heavy storms could cause those plants to lodge or fall down. On that photo that you see there, those 4 photos besides the petiole and that signs of feeding is as a cutoff plant that's fallen over. And of course, that's a strong indicator end of season right prior to harvest that we've had a significant issue. I'm going to highlight some things here on the next slide that are earlier in the season that you could look for that will lead to some of those potential management decisions you're going to see. So to kind of highlight on this signs of infestations slide here is a healthy petiole on the top, and or a healthy petiole on the bottom and an infested petiole on the top. You can see how white that pith is in an uninfested petiole versus one that's had the larvae feed through it, kind of gets this reddish brown discoloration. Once they enter that main stem, that petiole can wilt and die. And that's a really key indicator of infestations along field borders where this insect's going to be heavy. This is not a strong flyer by any indication. When the adults are moving to adjacent soybean fields, they're really infesting the edge of the field the heaviest. And so you're going to see these potential indicators along the edge. So a wilted petiole in an otherwise healthy canopy is a good indicator you have an infestation. You should investigate further. There are other things that can cause this, especially if mowers are going along the edge of the field and happen to ding a few petioles. You could have some wilting from some other source. But be sure it's only one wilting petiole. In an otherwise healthy canopy. There are things that will outright kill plants, like one of the insects I work on, which is soybean gallmigid, has a lot of wilting petioles. And then we have diseases like Phytophthora that can produce similar symptoms. So if you see it, go further to tear off that petiole, look if there's a hole into that main stalk, and then use that, as an indication of whether or not you have an infestation in a particular field. Good time to do this is in August, that late July, early August timeframe, and it'll help give you an understanding of what type of pressure you're seeing. So to this point, I've maybe briefly mentioned, but mostly focused on the fact that these are feeding within the main stalk. When you split open those stems, you'll see a lot of destruction in that pith area of that plant. And I think that's alarming to a lot of growers, thinking, oh man, what is the impact to this plant from all of this pith being removed from the inside and all that feeding? And a lot of studies have been done. There's a lot of good references out there. Up to maybe 15% from that physiological, yield loss as a result of the feeding that it's occurring. That's in the absence of lodging. I think the majority, and Nick could speak to his area, but the majority of the calls that I get are really related to plants lodging at harvest, the inability to pick those plants up. That's where the real big yield losses come in. Those yield loss estimates are complicated by the fact that Dectes seems to kind of target the largest plants that have the greatest yield potential. And so there's a bit of influence there as well. And then, we saw this last year in Nebraska with a lot of dry weather late season. We had a lot of early harvests in areas. And as a result, we got a lot of early lodging or early girdling. And then some bad weather to follow caused a lot of lodging, and a lot of growers this past winter were kind of up in arms about Dectes Stem Borer and its impact. So we've certainly in Nebraska here been revisiting the conversation about Dectes. I want to really focus on this pith feeding and why, although it's happening, it's not as significant as something feeding on other parts of the plants. And so I have this soybean physiology slide here that has a dicot and a monocot stem. Monocot corn, is a good example. Dicot soybean, and you can see that inner tissue where the pith would be doesn't contain xylem or phloem. It has some of those properties. It can move water and nutrients through that space, but not at the same proportion as that outer layer. So if I take a soybean stem and kind of hold it out in front of you and dig my fingernail into it and peel away, where my fingernail contacts and that area I pull off, that area in my fingers would be the phloem. That's the critical part for moving nutrients through the plant. That inner area that I can tap with my fingernail, that's the water conducting part of the plant. Inside of all of that is this kind of corky area called the pith, where we would find Dectes. And so with Dectes not feeding on xylem or phloem, those outer areas, it's just difficult for it to cause a lot of impact on those plants, minus the up to 15% loss. But I'm sure Nick could speak to the same conversations I've had when you've got growers showing you plants that have been what it feels like the inner parts of it just taken out. They have a hard time believing this isn't causing significant impacts. One of the ways we've been able to show maybe perhaps the lack of potential of Dectes to cause significant yield losses in soybean is through the use of fipronil, which you cannot use on soybean. This is purely for academic purposes to demonstrate what the potential of this insect is to cause yield losses. And so Scott Stewart, Gus Lorenz, and a bunch of others conducted a lot of nice studies. And so this table kind of outlines several places through 2007 to 2011 where they had these plots that were pretty heavily infested, as you can tell by that first column. If you just go down that column, you can see that you're looking at 58 to 84% or 83%, of those infested plants occurring within those plots, and then the reduction by fipronil. So, if we had really great ability to just remove Dectes from that scenario, we got 97, 98%, reduction by the use of fipronil. One could draw what the potential impact of Dectes is if removed from the scenario. And you could see, really focus on that far column over, the yield change treated versus untreated, and just go down that whole column. You never really see more than a 4 bushel separation. A lot of those are even in the opposite direction, so a negative. Overall, 0.7 difference in yield change as a result of the use of fipronil. So I think that should highlight from a lot of people where the impact is a standing plant is a viable for harvest. There may be complications coming that I'm going to talk about here in a minute, but as far as what's been done, that doesn't seem to cause a lot of direct yield loss without those plants falling over. My last slide here before I hand this over to Nick is on the interactions with soybean gallmage. And I realize we could spend a whole 40 minutes talking about soybean gallmage, so I'm going to give it a very brief introduction and then talk about what we've been seeing in eastern Nebraska and western Iowa this past year, which is relatively new. Soybean gallmage has been limited to the base of soybean plants, except for the absence of hail damage. So that bottom figure that shows me grasping a plant at soil level and where the larvae are present just near the soil surface, that's typically all we find of that insect. But with Dectes and heavy infestations this year, where those adults were coming in to chew off parts of that petiole, the underside of that petiole, before laying their eggs, we found soybean gallmage followed them into those spaces. And so we were finding large numbers of soybean gallmage larvae in the petioles of soybeans, which is not a typical thing we would expect to see. And so there was concern. There was some top dieback in soybeans occurring from these infestations. And it raises concerns about soybean gallmage, which causes significant yield losses when it's present in high numbers. We're talking anywhere from 17 to 31% yield losses on field averages. Its interaction with Dectes brings kind of in a new dynamic. And so whether or not this interaction continues or this is a one-time event because they happen to line up, we don't know. We just don't have enough observation. But I'll ask those that are in gallmage areas where they know infestations are occurring on overlap with Dectes to pay attention to this interaction. This interaction between soybean gallmage and a borer is not unique. We have one that occurs also with a weevil on sweet clover, and so soybean gallmage has been following other insects into plants in other parts of its host range as well. With that, I'm going to pass this over to Nick to talk about some of the management.
As he mentioned, I'm Nick Seiter. I'm a field crop entomologist at University of Illinois. When we talk about management of Dectes Stem Borer, it can be a little bit challenging in some ways. Her recommendations aren't always as clear as we would like them to be. But the foundation of this management is going to be focusing on preventing or at least mitigating the impact of lodging. So as Justin mentioned, the larval tunneling itself is going to be less significant for yield of soybean than that lodging is. You can get pretty serious impacts, not just on yield, but on the time taken to harvest when you have a lot of lodging due to plants falling over from these stem borer larvae. Now, the best management that we see for that is getting a timely harvest. There's no soybean farmer probably anywhere in the world that doesn't want to get a timely harvest, right? This isn't something that we're not lollygagging this time of year, just letting fields sit out for fun. So a lot of this does depend on the weather. And for us in Illinois, the years where we've seen the biggest impacts of this insect in terms of lodging have been years where we struggled to get into the field because of poor weather, because it got wet during harvest. These plants were starting to fall over and we just couldn't get into the field. And we can't control that. We can't do anything about harvest progress. If we could, everybody would be done by now. We're recording this in late October. Everybody would have been done probably a month and a half ago, and they'd be sitting around in their shops partying, congratulating themselves on how well harvest went, right? Weather is a big driver of this. What we can do is go out earlier in the season, identify those fields that have the highest levels of infestation. And if you want to think of like 50% infestation with Dectes Stem Borer as kind of a benchmark for, hey, you know, I need to do something about this field. I need to prioritize this field, get it out of there as soon as I can. That's probably a good benchmark to use, but kind of get a feel if you've been struggling with this insect, and especially if you've had problems with lodging before. Get a feel for the percent infestation, the relative percent infestation of your fields, and prioritize accordingly. And if you've got a field that has 50, 60, 70, we'll see 80, 90% of plants infested with this insect in some cases. Those are fields that you want to get harvested just as soon as you can. Put them at the front of the line, get them out of there. In terms of monitoring for that infestation, you know, obviously you can go out and split the stems open and look for the larvae. Obviously, that's not the easiest thing to do. Justin mentioned those broken off, those flagged petioles. That's a great early indication that you've got a problem. Starting around July on into August, you start to see that. That's a good indication that you have a lot of this. Occasionally, we'll see sawdust gather at the base of these stems that have already been girdled. We don't often see a lot of that, but if you start seeing that's a pretty good indication that things are about to happen. You know, at that point, when you see that sawdust that you can see in the lower right at the base of the stems, that's an indication that that girdling has already occurred. Now, what these insects are doing when they're girdling it, it's kind of interesting. They're cannibals, like Justin mentioned. And if you're the first one to get down there, and another larva comes in after you and eats you, that's not really necessarily what you want. So they girdle that stem, they pack it full of frass, and they create a little overwintering cavity for themselves down there at the base of the stem. So they're not necessarily trying to ruin harvest, but that's just sort of what occurs as a result of that. And you'll see this is a very weak point in the stem. It breaks off. Often it breaks off in that kind of a rounded off, a circular way, as you can see there. And if you split that stem open, you'll find the larva at the base. Now, one of the things that really makes management challenging, we don't have good luck, or at least we don't have consistent luck with chemical control. Like a lot of other insects, when the insect feeds inside of the plant, we really struggle to get insecticides to it. We don't have a lot of systemic materials available to us in soybean. Justin mentioned fipronil. We don't have that one. We can't recommend that one. So we've found that we can control the adults, you know, fairly effectively. They're fairly susceptible to insecticides. But because they're laying their eggs over such a long period of time, often that control of the adults doesn't necessarily translate into great reduction in stem boring. So there was a study out of Kansas where they had 2 insecticide applications. It was Warrior, I believe, a pyrethroid, and they achieved 74% control of the adults with those 2 applications. That only resulted in a 46% reduction in stem boring. Those were well-timed applications that were targeted towards Dectes Stem Borer. Typically, I don't know about in Nebraska, and we might talk about this a little bit. When we apply insecticides in Illinois, very often it's going out because of a fungicide application at R3. It's not necessarily timed to coincide with Dectes Stem Borer adult activity. We're not going to see very good reduction from that kind of an approach. But even if we do, that ovipositional period is so long, we're still going to see a lot of stem boring. These adults move in and out of the field. They can come in from other areas, and they're laying eggs over a long period of time. Down in Arkansas, where I used to work, we achieved 30 to 40% control of stem tunneling with chlorantraniliprole. We'd classify that, I think, as suppression, is what most people would call that. Not that great in terms of reduction from that insecticide application. Unclear how much of an impact that would actually have on preventing lodging, but it's certainly not something that we could hang our hat on. And when you add up the relatively poor reduction in stem boring that we see, even from the best results we can get with an insecticide, with the fact that the lodging doesn't always happen, it's unpredictable whether it's going to happen. There's a lot of weather conditions that have yet to occur at the time you would have to do this control to determine whether that happens. We generally don't recommend chemical control as an approach for this because multiple applications are going to be needed. I don't know what satisfactory control is. It's not 40%. It's not 46%. We need to do a little better than that to make this worth our while. And then the lodging and the yield loss that ultimately accompanies that is going to be unpredictable. Again, much better off prioritizing heavily infested fields for harvest, getting those out as soon as you can to avoid that lodging, than to try and throw an insecticide at this when those larvae are protected inside of the stem. There are a few other potential control avenues out there. I'll warn you ahead of time, none of them are all that satisfactory, but we'll do the best we can with this. One thing to point out with soybean varieties, there are differences in varietal susceptibility to this insect. In general, they're not terribly well defined. And my impression is, in general, it's not so much that we have resistant varieties out there, varieties that aren't going to get infested by Dectes Stem Borer. It's that we have certain varieties that are prone to lodging that you're likely to see an impact from this. And so occasionally we'll get these reports from seed reps that, they had a variety trial out and one variety or two varieties or three varieties went down. Really struggled with this lodging from stem borer in a way that some of the other varieties did not. Unfortunately, the traits that are involved in this, other than generally, you want to get a variety that has good stem resilience, that's resistant to lodging in general. But we don't have anything that's commercial that we could classify as like a resistant variety for Dectes Stem Borer. There has been a report of some antibiosis in PIs in plant introductions. As far as I'm aware, that hasn't translated into like agronomically acceptable Dectes Stem Borer resistant varieties. But there are some differences out there that you might notice. And if you struggle with Dectes Stem Borer, if you've had this lodging issue pop up, you might want to look for a variety with good stem resilience that's resilient to lodging in general to help you to deal with lodging specifically from this insect pest. There are some other cultural practices that play a role here. Certainly tillage has an impact. So a study back in the 70s showed that if you bury residue in December, that reduces larval survival over the winter by 20 to 50%. Again, this isn't something we would consider control, right? So I'm not telling you to go out with your tillage and till up all these Dectes fields and that's going to solve your problem. It's not. What we see in Illinois, or at least what we think we're seeing in Illinois, is probably more of a regional impact of where we have a lot of no-till. That's also where we see a lot more of this insect. We've been doing a survey since 2021. I have the 2021 results up there you can kind of see on your screen. 2022, very similar to this. Down in South Central Illinois, where we have hills, we don't see that in Champaign where I'm at. We don't have that feature to our environment. But in southern third of Illinois, we've got a lot of topography. We've got a lot of no-till as a strategy to reduce that erosion. That does, on a regional level, seem to result in higher levels of Dectes Stem Borer. My understanding is they see similar over in Indiana, though we haven't surveyed over there. And I would guess there's similar impacts elsewhere. Not every state's like Illinois, where we have this real sharp dividing line, where the glacier stopped. South of that, we got a lot of no-till. North of it, we love tilling in central Illinois, but where you do have that, that's going to play a role here. But keep in mind, and you could mention the same thing with crop rotation, for instance, rotating with a non-host crop. These insects do move. They've got not a huge travel radius, but within a mile or so, they'll move from field to field. And so you're not necessarily going to stop this insect by tilling. So it's not something that we necessarily recommend as a control tactic, but it is something that if you realize you're in an area where you're no-till, your neighbors are no-till, you got a lot of no-till going on, then it's something that you need to maybe pay a little bit more attention to. And one thing I should state, there's also obviously a north-south component here. Like, probably this insect does a little bit better where the winters aren't quite so harsh. I don't think anyone's done a study on it, but considering they're finding it in Nebraska, in the Dakotas, well north of us in Illinois, and they can still find it as a pest, I think the reason we see so many more of them in the southern third of our state is related to tillage rather than just the latitude. The other thing to note here, control of weedy hosts, and this is sort of speculative. I haven't seen anyone do a study where they took out giant ragweed, which is a great alternative host for this insect. Cocklebur also is. I haven't seen a study where they took these plants out and it reduced Dectes Stem Borer populations, but it sure can't hurt. And if you're like me, you don't have a lot of use for giant ragweed anyway. Makes me pretty sick. I want to get rid of this stuff. So I'm telling you that, I'm not just I don't want to lie to you and tell you get rid of giant ragweed and it'll get rid of Dectes Stem Borer. I'll tell you the truth and say, get rid of giant ragweed. It'll be better for your airways, and you might reduce that Dectes Stem Borer population a little bit as well. There's also been some studies actually looking at ovipositional preference of this insect and using sunflower as essentially a trap crop for it. Sunflower is much more attractive to Dectes Stem Borer than soybean is. And so the idea is if you put out a perimeter of sunflower and have that out there with your soybean, that they'll infest the sunflower and leave the soybean alone. Haven't looked at that in Illinois, haven't looked at it directly, but it is out there and could be an option for you, especially if you're in an area where you produce a little bit more sunflower. We don't do a lot of sunflower in Illinois unless we're doing it for agritourism. There's a big sunflower maze just north of me. But they do have a pretty strong preference for sunflower. In terms of biological control, there are a number of parasitoids that attack this, including at least 7 wasps. I believe there's a few more parasitoid wasps that attack Dectes Stem Borer, and at least 1 tachinid fly. Most of these have been confirmed in sunflower, which of course is a better host for this insect. But we do observe parasitized individuals. In southern Illinois, we observe them somewhat routinely in soybean. It's unclear how much of an impact this has at the population level. Anecdotally, we've seen fields where we sampled adults early in the season, had large numbers of adults, came back at the end of the season, and we had a fair amount of stem tunneling, but very few larvae. What we did have was a lot of parasitized larvae. And so probably, at least in some cases, this can have an impact. It's unclear what this is going to look like. Oftentimes when we see the greatest impacts from parasitoids like these, it's when that population of the host is built up to a critical level. So probably some density dependent mortality here relating to parasitism. So there are some natural enemies out there for this insect. a lot of these have been reported. There's host records, but not necessarily a lot of information about what the population level impact is of these natural enemies. And so kind of in summary, our big focus in Illinois, and we can talk a little bit about how management might differ among the states. Our focus is on trying to minimize that lodging, especially by prioritizing those fields that are most heavily infested with an early harvest wherever we can. We generally don't recommend chemical control. It's not that you can't get some reduction, you can. That reduction in general is not very satisfactory, and it takes multiple applications to get it. And again, we really can't predict when that lodging is going to be a big issue at the time that these applications would have to go out. There are impacts from variety, there's impacts from cultural practices, and there's impacts from natural enemies. So all of these things play a role. We don't have any one of these that we can lean on to say, this is how you manage Dectes Stem Borer. But through an IPM approach, all of these working together can help to reduce those populations. And with that, I think Justin and I wanted to maybe have a little bit of a discussion on how things might differ between our two states. One thing I noticed, you put up like the period of activity of the adults, the period of ovipositional activity when the larvae are active. That's all exactly what we see in Illinois. So not big differences there. So that's good. When I was in Arkansas, it was pretty similar as well. But what are you seeing in Nebraska, Justin? And does any of what you see differ from kind of what we see in Illinois?
Your management recommendations mirror ours. The timely harvest is number one. We don't really recommend tillage, and a lot of the conversation around tillage is, okay, if I'm going to do it because I have gallmage too, and anecdotally maybe there's something with gallmage, how much of this field do I till? And I think growers are wondering on spatial stuff, but that's few and far between. Like that's like one in almost 100 growers is really interested in the tillage option. Most are not. Yep. So it's a pretty minor conversation. Control of hosts, I'm glad you brought up ragweed. That's the one where we're really pushing a lot of growers. Typically those calls that we get, it seems to be with enough conversation, it's a past field that had ragweed in it or along field borders, and that's where they're kind of spurring from. Whether or not growers are taking concise action against ragweed, I don't know if they're doing that, but that's not one that I would really lift up. And your host plant resistance, certainly work going on in Nebraska. Adoption, strategic, I'm going to plant this variety. I don't know if that's really happening. Growers are kind of still just doing things the way they normally would.
Yeah, and we don't have a lot of that either. I think in general, people, if they've struggled with this in the past, they're probably looking for a variety that's going to stand up generally. But we don't have a lot of information on our commercial varieties, other than occasionally we'll get a note from someone like, hey, I planted variety XYZ. It went down, man. Like it really struggled with lodging from this insect. And yeah, for us, I mean, it really relates to the season. This year in Illinois so far, it's been a pretty good harvest season. Like we've been able to get into most of our fields when we wanted to. The struggle for us maybe this year is a lot of stuff got planted all at the same time. And so a lot of our fields are ready at the same time. But I haven't gotten a lot of reports. In fact, I don't think I've gotten any reports so far this year of lodging. Usually those kind of come in after the fact. Usually people are occupied right now. They're going to tell me in January, yeah, I had a big issue with lodging. But I think we're doing pretty good this year.
One thing in Nebraska that we got a lot of calls on this year, and I'd be interested if you saw this at all in Illinois, but growers were calling us from different parts of the state and consultants as well, saying that Dectes Stem Borer is killing soybean plants. And that's a very hard thing for you or I to kind of swallow, knowing what we know about the biology of this insect. And so, a plant pathologist and I spent some time in a number of fields. There's a high frequency of Dectes Stem Borer. As you mentioned, you can have pretty high frequencies in soybean fields. We found a lot of diseases. that in those plants, but failed to find anything that would really point to Dectes alone. I was just wondering, have you experienced that in Illinois, and what's your thoughts on that?
Oh yeah. Experienced it in Illinois and experienced it especially in Arkansas. So I'll give you one example specifically in Arkansas. Went to a field, went with the seed dealer, went with the farmer. They were sure that Dectes Stem Borer was killing the plants in this field. What we found was that root knot nematode was killing plants in this field. There's some nasty nematode problems in Arkansas for those of you who aren't familiar with that area. And if you looked in the area that was most heavily infected, yeah, it was 80% infested with Dectes Stem Borer. If you looked in the healthier areas elsewhere in the field, it was 80% infested with Dectes Stem Borer. I remember it's similar with the chemical control. We did, I believe it was a foliar application study. I was just a dummy on this study. I was going out and splitting stocks for Gus, actually. But they had done treated, untreated strips, with a foliar insecticide trying to control Dectes Stem Borer. And they killed the adults. They went out into the untreated, splitting stems, 80%. They went out into the treated where they sprayed an insecticide, 80%. No difference, So you got to compare those affected areas with what's going on elsewhere. But man, this is a showy pest. And when you split that stem open, it looks bad. It looks real bad. It's hard to believe when you see that's not the cause of whatever problem that plant has. I know something I'm interested in, and this is kind of speculative, but when we look at that, like fipronil, no fipronil, we look at these plants, and there's no yield difference whatsoever. That data that Gus and Scott and others had, really good, convincing data, especially from the Mid-South there. In other cases, I guess there have been at least individual site years where you do see a difference. And there was that report, I think that report was from Kansas, right, where they reported 15% physiological yield. I wonder if timing could have an issue there, like how early they got going, those larvae got going in those plants, because it really varies a lot. We have larvae starting from early July all the way up till mid to late August. And you think, like, if most of that boring happens late in the season, well, seed fill's already done at that point. They're not going to have much of an impact on that plant. But like you mentioned, I know the vast majority of that tissue that they're feeding on, it's not vascular tissue. It's just the kind of the structural stuff inside of that plant. But yeah, that's something I'm interested in, is what's going on there. For us, I mean, we can't control it very well anyway. So in some situations, it's kind of academic, unless we're going to have a fipronil seed treatment approved, which we're not.
Yeah, I've seen the use of fipronil from an academic standpoint in Nebraska, because all that data is south of us, to say, well, what's happening in these northern areas. I think it gets to your point, which is this timing of infestation. Is that something unique to this? So we just got a recently funded Nebraska soybean borer project to tackle that. And so, I'll likely be picking your brain quite a bit as we go through that. Part of my interest in that project was to check this interaction between Dectes and soybean gallmage, for some potential increased pressure, from a species that we don't expect a lot from, to one that we know, soybean gallmage can cause a lot of losses. So yeah, I'll be intrigued by that. But the timing is something that is of significant interest. Planting dates and other things could be kind of an interaction on plant development. Although doing any small study seems kind of tricky and trivial if they have a preference on plant size. So you kind of can get a confounding process on that. So I found, not personally doing a lot of research, but it's a challenging insect because of its behavior to do a lot of work on, a lot easier work on things like gallmage and aphids. And
well, you got a big problem with gallmage out there. Like that's a whole nother deal. Much bigger pest than this is in your part of the world. I'm glad you mentioned planting date. I know there's been some work, I believe, where they showed more impacts on lodging in full season compared with like double cropped soybean. I know in Arkansas, and we never did, I don't think we ever had any kind of a formal study on this, but we felt like soybean that was planted like last week of April, first week of May, which was a pretty, pretty ideal planting date in that part of the world, tended to be the most heavily affected by this. And as you started to get later, you didn't have as big of an impact with the lodging, not necessarily the percent infestation. And presumably these larvae have to reach a certain size to really girdle that stem effectively. And probably the earlier they get going in there, the better able they are to do that, to make it down to the base and girdle that stem.
That brings up a question. I'm not, sure if this is in the literature somewhere, if I haven't read it yet, but, we have a lot of conversation around other pests about planting field borders first and kind of creating this trap crop scenario with this, larger plant and then planting the inner part of the field later. And so like the sunflower border plantings, does an edge of field planting create a trap crop scenario where you can concentrate your management strategy? So maybe there's something out there already that I haven't found that I'll have to do some searching for, or maybe that's something that can be looked at.
You haven't seen it, I haven't seen it either. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but
that's true. Yeah.
Two of us that haven't seen it. And there's not that many, as those of you reading or listening might imagine. There's a good number of studies on this insect, but not that many. It's not as well studied as a, European corn borer, Western cornworm, stink bugs, even things like green clover worm, Japanese beetle. It's not as well studied as a lot of our other pests. And it's relatively new as a soybean pest, something that, apparently jumped hosts back in the 60s. And I know you mentioned it really coming on in Nebraska since did you say the 2000s, the 2010s?
Yep.
Similar situation, I'd say, for us, maybe even a little bit later for us. I know it seems like it's the last 5-10 years people have really been paying attention to it here. We're always a little curious, how much of that it's hidden in the stem and people weren't paying attention to it versus how much of it is, it's really emerging as a pest. I think that lodging grabs people's attention. So I think there is something going on that has caused this to increase in prevalence, but I don't necessarily know what that is. Is the insect adapting to soybeans, still in the process of adapting to this host plant, and it's simply doing a better job of accessing that as a pest? Is it building up in numbers? I know here in Illinois, it's not like we've got sunflower they can feed on. We got plenty of giant ragweed. We've got, I don't know. I'd hesitate to guess how many acres of giant ragweed we have in Illinois. It's way too many, that's for sure.
There's a lot around here.
Yeah, every creek, every railroad track, all that. And that, it's one of those plants that, you can try to control it, but unless you want to spray every ditch bank, which most people don't.
Yeah. Well, Nick, I learned a lot from your talk. This is pretty interesting. I think there's a lot of space and movement on Dectes. It's just challenging to find a project that you can separate out what you actually want to look at.
That's right. And we struggle with the same thing, just getting a consistent location to do the work and have them show up year after year. But really interesting pest, and one I hope I learned a lot from your talk as well, and hopefully the folks viewing this webinar benefit from it.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you.